My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask you for pardon for my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Well, we always start that time of prayer in the same way, but I suppose in a particular way, Jesus, what I want to say with all my heart is that I might make this time of prayer fruitful. Because in just an instant of prayer, we can turn our whole life around. And that essentially is the feast that we celebrate today with the conversion of St. Paul. With one encounter with you, Jesus, his whole life completely and irreversibly changed. He went from being one of the greatest persecutors of the Christian church to being possibly even the greatest of all the apostles, going to the ends of the world as he knew it in order to bring the gospel. And all because of an instant of prayer, an instant of encounter, one that he wasn't even seeking. But you spoke to him and he spoke back to you. And that's what we're doing in this time of prayer, Jesus. Maybe it's not as dramatic as the scene as we read it from the first reading of the Mass today. Paul on his way to Damascus in order to persecute the church. Well, if by chance any of the great persecutors are listening to this meditation, may you be like Paul and may you fall and may you rise up in Christ. But for the vast majority of us, we're probably just going about our daily life and we're not expecting any great thing to happen to us today, perhaps. But we want you to be in this day, Jesus. And we want to convert our day to you, because let's say this feast only really has any significance if we make conversion our own. We follow in the footsteps of St. Paul. Now, I was just thinking, what would have happened if Paul hadn't have converted? So let's imagine the scene. He's fired up with his mission to go to Damascus in order to round up all these Christians who he genuinely thought were doing the wrong thing, that were spreading lies about faith and religion, and it was something to be stopped. He went with real conviction. And he's blinded by this awesome light and hears your voice, Jesus. But if he was dull of heart, perhaps, what if Paul just hadn't have responded? What if Paul hadn't have understood exactly what was happening to him and felt it was not you that was truly calling him Jesus, but maybe even something harmful, and he had ignored it? Well, probably we tend to think that, well, there's no way possibly Paul could have ignored this because Jesus spoke to him. And this event that occurred in his life was so dramatic that he was blinded, albeit temporarily, by this light, that he just simply could not have ignored that. We tend to think that whenever God intervenes, when God makes himself known in these kind of big and dramatic ways, then, well, there's just no possibility. You have to just go with it. But I just don't think that was the case. I don't think it's automatic that Paul just completely turned his life around because of the event. I think it's true, Jesus, that perhaps at times we might hold back a little bit because we don't feel your presence completely and totally, or perhaps we just think if God makes this known to me in some sort of amazingly grand way, then there's no possible way I could refuse it. But in actual fact, we think about some of the biggest decisions that we've had to make in our life, even though perhaps, Jesus, you were making your will perfectly well known to us, we were resisting that. And I think that's more obvious when at times we resist temptation, or perhaps even when we don't resist temptation, that perhaps we are led by our conscience to know what the right thing to do is, but just something makes us go the other direction. Now, that's not quite the same as this blinding light, I appreciate, on the road to Damascus. But let's just think for a moment that Paul doesn't accept. And he continues on and he persecutes the church with even greater vigor because he really thinks that there are things distracting him from his mission. Well, the story obviously would have been very different. But I'd like to think that Paul at least had the capacity to ignore that. I'd like to think that Paul at least had the capacity to not convert in that moment, because it means that he was completely free. It means that he chose to follow you, Jesus, Yes, because of this overpowering encounter, but not just because he's a robot, but because he freely chose to leave behind some sense the life that he had lived up to that moment and to embrace you in a new way. And that's fundamentally, I think, how God acts in each one of our lives. That even if God was to manifest himself in a very dramatic and powerful way to us, he leaves us free. He does not force himself upon us. We have celebrated Christmas and we see that God comes with power and might, but in the form of a little baby. And it's the invitation to change that he makes to Paul in a dramatic way. But it's up to Paul ultimately to stop persecuting the church and to choose instead to follow in the way that Jesus was laying for him. And I think that essentially all conversion only comes through real, true freedom. That we choose to follow you, Jesus, or we choose to reject something that is contrary to you because we want to change our lives. There's a desire there. There's part of our will. It's not that we're being forced to do it. I think that forced conversions will never really have any effect. If we're being forced to do something, we might do it out of obligation or because we instinctively might know it's the right thing to do. But if we don't truly love it with all of our hearts, then what impact is it really going to have in our life? No. Real conversion becomes true, I suppose, with our freedom. I think it's true when you think about the example of our sinfulness, is that really we most of the sins we commit freely. But when we choose to abandon a particular sinful course of action, or we choose freely to go to confession and to accept the penance and to do that with a free heart, well, there's a real moment of conversion. There's a point in our life whenever things really begin to change. Now, how different could things be for me today and in my life if I could freely choose to put you, Jesus, at the center of my life and to reject all of those things that drag me away from you, to say no to those little sinful, tempting inclinations, but instead to choose the path that you're laying down for me. And one of the curious details about the whole Paul conversion story is that he continues to go to Damascus. In a sense, what I think is that Paul's conversion, it changes his life rapidly and radically, yes. But the real difference is that he puts Jesus at the center of his life. He continues to go where he had set out to go to. So in a sense, his destination doesn't change. There's nothing completely radical about the days that follow his conversion. He continues to go as he had planned to go. But it's different because he puts everything else aside in his life to find a new priority. And that becomes the defining characteristic of Paul. It's why Paul is the greatest missionary ever, because he lived completely and totally with Jesus at the center of his life. And if we see something in St. Paul that we like Jesus, it's probably that. It's probably the fact that he could do it. He could put you at the center of his life and live a life which was completely and totally for you. And that's something which is so attractive for us. There has to be an effect to the choices that we make. Let's say that if we have the desire to be like Paul, to put to put you at the center of our lives, or to convert even to Catholicism, perhaps even that's the desire that we have for some other Christians today. But it has to be seen in the moment of conversion that we make. There has to be an effect to it, so that we belong completely and totally to you, Jesus, and that in some way that might be tangible in our life, that it might be visible, that we at least are putting you at the center and trying to make it a little bit less about ourselves. I remember whenever I was ordained a deacon, and the parish priest in the parish where I was, said something very beautiful. You know, in the rite of an ordination, a man lies completely prostrate before the altar. And he said that on the day of our ordination, we lay our lives before the altar. But we spend the rest of our life trying to take that back again. And our whole daily conversion will be trying to lay our life before you, Jesus, before your altar, and not to take back the gifts that I have already given to you, what I have received. So help me, Jesus, in all the ways that I need you to convert really and truly today. and to make my life about you. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you have communicated to me during this meditation. I ask your help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, St. Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.